listening to Dissecting Worlds, the Geek Syndicate podcast on the social sciences in science fiction, fantasy and horror. What do they know of geekery, if only geekery know? And now, over to your hosts.
Hello dear listeners, you're listening to Dissecting Worlds, a unscheduled transmission kicked off from a Twitter conversation. And I'm a little nervous because we've got a proper grown-up podcaster with us. Who does proper grown-up podcasting with sound effects and actors and guest presenters and things like that. So we've got Roifeld Brown, who does, amongst other podcasts, and I'm probably going to forget some, 10 American Presidents, which is how I first came across your work, which is amazing.
Thank you.
Transatlantic is no Mid-Atlantic, which I'm now an avid listener to. Dum De Dum, which I don't listen to because I'm a lap starcher addict. And How Jamaica Conquered the World. Is that it, or is there more?
And there is another one, Friday 15.
The music one, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's relatively new. I've been doing it about 6 months. I interview just random people for 15 minutes and 15 minutes worth of music. It's called Friday 15. I don't quite get them out every Friday, but that's the plan. I have put one out on a Saturday before, slap wrists, but it's good fun. So yeah, I podcast 24/7.
I'm starting to develop a theory that podcasting may be addictive. And all we're doing by getting guests on is encouraging them.
Absolutely. And then when you have a throwaway comment in one of your shows that at the age of 8 you created a world, and then somebody tweets you back and says, you should write an article about this, or potentially come on our podcast and talk about it. You know, it's total immersion. Total immersion. So thank you for indulging me.
That's all right. That's
no problem at all. So as Roifeld's alluded there, and in a throwaway comment towards the end of the podcast, you talked about how you were like looking back at imaginary maps, and when you were a kid, you developed this world, Argentina. And then what triggered my interest, you mentioned wargaming as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, I'm of West Indian origin. And I just remember growing up, me, myself and my cousins created this world of which my country was Argentina, his was Manon, and there were various other islands. And we kept this nonsense going for years, way beyond when we should have put it behind us. And obviously we were quite nerdy, geeky kids and didn't really know that we were at the time. So it started we used to recycle chip paper. So that's how old I am. When you could, if you got a bag of chips and there wasn't too much oil and grease on it, then you'd use it and you'd draw on it, in the mid 70s. And that's where we started drawing out our first maps. And it kind of went on in some shape or form for at least 7 or 8 years, off and on, where we kept on refining it and then creating histories. And then round about the age of 12, when I discovered Napoleon Bonaparte, I decided to go to war with my other cousins and grab bits of their territory. So it just went on for years and years.
It just evolved into invading your cousins' territories. It all sounded so idyllic, and then it was like, no, having that bit, that's a nice map, we'll have that bit.
Well, absolutely, but there is, I suppose, a child psychologist could absolutely go to town with actually what we were trying to depict, and also our understanding of the world, whether it's politically, but also historically as well. Because I remember watching the film Waterloo with Rod Steiger at the age of 12. It was Christmas time, and that changed me completely. I became a warmonger. I really did, and I wanted to become an emperor. I wanted to grab territory, and I said to my cousins, "Right, I'm declaring war." And and you just play out this stuff, but behind it was this massive love of maps. Always loved a map, but then with political geography, I'm not so much bothered about rivers unless they're boundaries to some kind of administrative region. Not really bothered about mountains unless they do a similar thing to rivers. But it's really why countries are the shape that they are, and why do the roads go the way that they go, and et cetera, et cetera. And then when you have all that down, you then try and work out the history, and you kind of, retrocon a history back onto this stuff. And, and that was a significant part of my childhood.
So when you went to war, did you use a mechanism for that, or was it just kind of verbalized and sort of sorted out that way?
Well, what we did at first, it was totally ridiculous, and this is not going to make any sense. I've thought about this over the weekend before recording this, and how am I going to explain this? And it makes no sense. But we were just playing with pencil and paper at first, and I would draw a little line, let's say it was 1/2 a centimetre, and that would be my navy leaving my country, going towards his. He could kind of intercept me, but we'd have to decide at the start how many ships we had. For argument's sake, they said we had 15 each. But how we didn't just have 15 each and just intercept each other, heaven only knows. So I'm missing out some 12-year-old rule on this. I just can't really remember. But we could dodge each other, and then we would hit each other's countries, and then we'd shade in approximately a centimetre in terms of land that we'd occupied. Again, why he couldn't just push back and then just rub it out, I cannot remember. But I remember one.
You just be kids' logic, can't you? I've got this bit now. All right, okay.
Well, exactly. There's obviously some ridiculous kids' logic, but I remember one Christmas period. That beautiful, idyllic period between Christmas Day and New Year's Day, when you forget what day of the week it is. They came round to mine, and we went to war, and ultimately I won, and I had his western seaboard of Mannan, and I captured his city, Jamaica City, and another allusion to the fact that we had West Indian parents. And we fought a big battle around a town called Rasterfield, but I didn't quite capture it. Again, alludes to the fact that we're black kids playing all this stuff. So, and then the new boundaries went on for years. I said this is serious stuff.
So in terms of in the maps, do you have you talked about the geography and it not being, so the maps, do they have geography that then in theory affects how the outcomes happen then? Or are you making that kind of stuff up on the fly?
I'm going to say no. The only really significant bit of geography was here is where the land is, here's where the sea is. It wasn't a case of here is a mountain range, so you can't just walk over that, you're going to have to go around it. Or here is a big river, you're going to have to pause here and then find some way of traversing this river. I remember there was a big river called the River Run, which went all the way around literally in a full circle. But I remember being sophisticated enough to not make it totally circular. But in effect, it was a River Rhine. It was the River Rhine and the River Danube type of thing. And it's called the River Run. But you could just go straight past it. I was sophisticated enough to know that rivers didn't go around in total circles within islands. But not sophisticated enough to say, well, okay, if we fight in a battle, we might need to pause or go round this river.
Or penalties for trying to ford it, or whatever.
Exactly.
I'm still flabbergasted that a 12-year-old had the patience to sit through Waterloo, because I'm 43.
I was mesmerised by it. I really was.
I find the stylised acting a challenge. Let's put it that way.
I just find the thing about how the geography of the battle seem interesting, because I think there's when you look at how military history stuff, I've always been a fan of history and I've never been interested in geography. And that kind of split at school. Just geography, it's all how the water table works, right? And then history's always been first love of academic subjects I'm not very good at, I guess is the way of describing it. And military history has always been really interesting. That's partly because, again, being a kid of the 70s, most of the comic books I read and stuff are British comic books, and they're all very, very World War II focused.
Yeah.
They're all beating up the Germans and shooting down Messerschmitts and stuff. So I'm a kind of sucker for that. That has a kind of emotional connection to me. But the military history, and even that I read growing up, largely just treats things as maps. They just treat them as flat. When you're talking about battle groups moving across Europe and in Russia and stuff, it largely just treats the geography as flat. And then the more modern books that I've got that often talk about the same battles put a lot of emphasis on the geography and always downplay that kind of like wargaming, that kind of wargaming view on it. So that's why it's quite interesting. Your maps are quite flat. You essentially treat them as flat again, aren't you? You know, it's like
in effect we treated it as, yes, a flat billiard table, and you could do really whatever you wanted. What I've neglected to say though is that I did have a second stab at this world building malarkey. So there was Sargentina Man and Biddyland and Bidryland, and these were these collection of islands, which was myself and my cousins. And, as I said, West Indian kids, funny enough, what we recreated was the Caribbean, a collection of islands. Round about the age of 13, 14, when I kind of got into a form of wargaming, with friends at school, I created an island continent, and we did this over maybe a period of 2 years, much more off than on. And we had countries that, abutted each other, that had political boundaries, and we would have wars, and then I would write up the histories of this continent. And with that, by the time I was 14, 15, we must have stopped it when we were at 15, because girls kind of took over, and, that kind of nonsense had to be put to one side. But, it was a case of, well, there are mountains here. You can't just wander in here. Here is a cove. Here is a bay. Here's a river, etc., etc. Your knowledge of the physical world and how it would impact on battles and war, definitely came in by the time of 14, 15.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and on the whole the islands thing, it's amazing how many published fantasy worlds tend to have one large continent with a land border in the east and lots of coastline in the west. Like the majority of fantasy seems to have that.
Incredibly Eurocentric.
Yeah, and it's literally like, this is fantasy Europe. There are other ways to build a continent, guys. It's not,
Well, the classic archipelago is Wizard of Earthsea, isn't it? That's the classic fantasy archipelago. But from what I'm hearing, your worlds weren't fantasy worlds. They were much more kind of... Was it Napoleonic, or were you kind of seeing it as modern technology, or in your imagination?
Well, I can't really... We must have seen the first one with Sargentina and Manon, etc., as of the time. So there was no idea that people were riding on horseback. We were children of the 70s, and very much like you guys, kind of very much influenced by the Second World War. So I presume we had the Second World War in mind. But the world which I created as a teenager with my school friends, absolutely, the first battle, and I remember being in Mr. Gray's geography lesson when I drew the map and was whispering, right, this is... Guys, I've got it. It's all sorted. Trust me on this, right? That started in 1900. So there was an idea that, of course, there were no tanks back then. So the first war was in 1900, and then I deliberately did them after the World War. So the second one was 1918 to, I forget when, it was probably went on for 4 years. And then the next one was 1945. But I was really clear when we did the 1945 one, there were no nuclear weapons. Our world was part of Earth, but nuclear technology hadn't got to our island.
In fairness, from a wargaming perspective, nuclear weapons are pretty dull.
Well, exactly.
They do end things alarmingly quickly. It's like, well, everyone dies. Well done, chaps.
So was Sargentina? This is, again casting back to your 12-year-old mind. Were these seen as, in your head? Were these like democracies, or were they like monarchies, or did it shift?
They were all monarchies at first. I think if you're a 10-year-old, an 11-year-old, and you live in a constitutional monarchy, you're the king, aren't you? You just are. Yeah. I'm sure your average American kid is probably conflicted between wanting to be a king and wanting to be a president. But there's something incredibly evocative about saying you are the king of. So we were all kings. And then what did it for me was watching Waterloo, and I went, wait a minute, you can go one step above this, you can be an emperor. That's what I wanted. So that's the reason why I went to war, because I wanted an empire. So,
I also think when you're a kid, like being in charge of, like, you know, you've got a lot of stuff you're not in charge of, and there's something really evocative. So you actually know, I'm the king of this world, or I'm the whatever my supreme authority is. It's like, because then I'm in charge, right? And I'm not in charge of anything else. I'm not even in charge of my own bedtime. It's like, but I can be in charge of this army and this whole, like, you know, shebang.
Listen, absolutely. And what I did, because I did take this just a little bit too far as a teenager. So when I went in and created the island kind of continent world with the, you know, political boundaries of the different countries, and went wargaming with my friends at school, I did really quite detailed histories. And at the time, I was absolutely in love with German history, but funnily enough, not really from Hitler onwards, because I just thought that's really unfair to the poor Germans. You know, back in the 19th century, they were seen as effete before the Prussians came along, and, you know, romantics and stuff, and Hansel and Gretel, whatever. And I was in love with the Holy Roman Empire, and I'm still massively in love with, you know, a nation, an empire that kind of isn't. So I kind of constructed a world which was kind of around that, and it kind of, a lot of the countries all had these Germanic sounding names. Like it wasn't a Prussia, but there was a Brussia, you know, and you know, it had all these kind of Germanic sounding names and stuff. And I deliberately set that in 1848 at first. So there was an idea
Good year.
that there were lots of republics, but there were lots of monarchies. And it was kind of an alternative European history where the republics had actually held on. They hadn't been rolled back by the monarchies. So, but the ideological split was between, it was in effect the Cold War, but between the countries that retained their monarchies and then the countries that were republics. Mm-hmm. And so we started in 1848. The European contagion has hit our island continent, and in effect, Hessian, which is obviously, you know, Hesse, had split east and west, and in effect, it was Germany. It was Germany post 1945, and the east was the Republic, which was diametrically opposed to the kingdom, which was in the west. And many of the countries split. Some of them just became republic, etc., and then we went on a fighting from there.
That's incredibly detailed. That's very cool.
I'm a bit worried. You keep saying I went a bit too far with this, and I'm thinking me and Matt still do this.
But it's weird, isn't it? Because the role from the tradition of being role player, you know, both long-time role players, and you start to spin off in role playing and start running your own games and running your own worlds. You know, it's very tempting to start building maps and bigger worlds for them. It becomes a slightly obsessive rabbit hole whenever you're creating a world, start trying to put geography down. And it's easy to justify when you're running a game for a bunch of players. They're always going to ask, where does this town sit next to this? If you're in the real world, it's easy. You can get a map, or we can look it up, or whatever, right? And if you're a fantasy world, if you're in a published world, say from a role-playing perspective, which kind of when you talk about Imagine Maps, is kind of where my brain went. If you play in like Greyhawk or, you know, one of the D&D worlds, you have books of maps you can just buy, right? And somebody will have spent ages building them. So when you build your own world,
they're very happy to take your money, to be fair.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I've got pull-out maps of Lovecraft Country for Call of Cthulhu, for example, where someone's literally mapped out Arkham, or, you know, that whole part of imaginary New England,
fictional New
England, which is a massive labour of love. Someone's obviously read all the books and all the surrounding material and tried to stitch it all together. But you don't really need it for the game. It's just like fun to have. The map itself is a physically fun thing to have. And I know when we've created, like you said, we've started running games, and I've got notes and maps of fictional worlds that like other people have played in, if you like, and that's part of the joy of it. It's like someone's taken my map and done something with it. Have you never thought of doing it that way, like, or were you like you making your own maps up for you, or were your friends using them?
This, by the time I was in senior school, I was acutely aware that this was a bit of an obsession, which I was lucky that I could share it with a few nerds in my class. But, they weren't taking this as seriously as I was. That I just took this on to another level. But I took it on to another level, not because I was into Dungeons and Dragons or any of that type of stuff, because I never have been, and I'm not. I just love maps and history. And for me, political history, why cities are the shape that they are, why is that little bit of France, why does it stick out into Germany a little bit, kind of at a right angle? Alsace-Lorraine, why is it that, why is it the border between France and Spain is where it is? Yeah, it's the Pyrenees, but why is there Andorra there? Type of thing. That just always fascinated me.
But you have you have a whole series of wars, don't you, over basically where countries' inverted commas natural boundaries are.
Exactly. Yeah. And that is you sound like Louis XIV and Richelieu now, going all the way to Emperor Napoleon III.
Yeah, which France's national borders. Exactly.
And Belgium, does it really have any right to exist? Because really it's just part of France and it's part of the Netherlands type of thing. Because there's a linguistic split as well. So there is the mountains, the rivers, the physical boundaries, and then there is here is a set of people that speak a tongue, and should they be all kind of counted together? Are you the king of France or the king of the French type of thing, or the emperor of the French? Is it the people or is it this area and stuff? And I just found that all ridiculously fascinating. And then titles, so I was the Prince Emperor of blah 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 and the Duke of wherever, and I created all and Mecklenburg, which is really Mecklenburg in Germany, was this place, and they had a ruling house called the Vigates family, and the Vigates family were minor democratic imperialists, and I just all this nonsense went on and on and on, and the more I talk about it with you, I'm getting all nostalgic for it. I think I'll have to dust off a bit of chip paper and start drawing again. I'll tell you, it's just, it was such a massive part of my childhood. But one of the things I've forgotten to say, if I put the later continent to one side, when growing up with my cousins, we were all kind of football crazy. And so we created all these cities, which were just points on a map. And at the age of 8, you have no real idea as to whether a city really would be situated here or there. But there were no mountains, So what we did, and in lots of ways, this is where this whole world really lived on. We created football teams. So each city had, a football team or two. So my capital was called Antingham, because at the age of 8 I was fascinated by ants and their society. Bees and ants to an 8-year-old boy, you can't.
Oh yeah, they're amazing.
Yeah, just how can they communicate and whatever. And so my capital was Antingham. So when we created our football league, I had Antingham City. I'm a Birmingham City fan, so they were the best team. Antingham United, and then there was Antingham County. Now, any football team with the suffix county invariably used to be good in the 19th century, like Notts County or Stockport County, but are rubbish now. So they were always the rubbish teams that were called county. And what we did, and this really went on for years, this went on for much longer than the actual creation of the maps and stuff. We would draw out the fixtures at the start of the year by putting the names into a tombola and then just drawing them out. And then we'd do that for the football scores. And we easily did about 25 seasons of this, easily. With promotion, relegation, we'd draw the kits and whatever. And as we got older, we got quite sophisticated with it. So you'd only have leagues of 6 or 8. There wouldn't be a home and away because we realised even back at age 8 there was no form and everything would kind of start to equal out. So we just ran it for 5 games of a league of 6. But then when we did the cup competitions and when we did the last game of the seasons, the home team, the away team, would only score half of actually what we pulled out of the hat. So there was some idea of home field advantage. And
it's a pretty brutal home field advantage, actually.
but you know, it's, again, but with your 10, 11, 12-year-old mind, you know, and a committee of 3, you know, you go, well, this kind of makes sense.
Yeah, and people will tell you, won't they? Home field advantage is a big deal, and all the commentators, when you watch football, they make it sound like it's a bigger deal than it actually is. So you'll pass that.
Yeah, Fortress and Town City.
Sorry?
It's like, well, you know, as a Tranmere fan, we have sometimes fooled ourselves that we've got Fortress Prenton. Thank you. Still a bit sore. But, you know, you do if you have a good run, you do kid yourself that your stadium is a fortress. So I can completely see, particularly if it was reflected in what was going on in games while you were making it up, why you'd go in that direction. I'm just devastated, Roifeld, because when you started going down this route, I was like, tell me you played out the games using subbuteo.
You know what? I got a sneaky feeling we kind of did we did a couple of times, and this is how far we took this. So we had, and this wasn't my idea, this was a cousin of mine's, but then he drew the cup. So we go back to the original world, you know, the world of Sargentina, Mannon and Biddyland and Bidryland. We had the Isles Golden Cup, because that's what it was called, the Isles. So the Isles Golden Cup was supposed to take place every 4 years, funnily enough. And I forget how, I presume we must have just drawn numbers out of a cup and just shook it around and whatever and stuff as to what the football scores were. But when we came to the final, because it was so prestigious and it was the Isles Golden Cup final, it only happened once every 4 years, but of course it happened in effect every Christmas and Easter when my cousins came round. Right, we actually played subbuteo. Problem is, though, I wasn't very happy about it because they were much better at me at it, so they would always win. So the finals actually were subbuteo for a couple of years, and then I said, there's an unfair advantage here because you guys...
You're better at subbuteo than me.
I was an only child, so I had no one to play subbuteo with, whereas there were 3 of them, so they all played with each other, so they were brilliant. Absolutely brilliant at it.
I was never good at subbuteo, I feel your pain.
I don't think I ever played it as a kid. I was that big a nerd.
Do you not even have the cricket version?
No, because I only got into cricket after I got into rave culture.
That is a weird entry level. That's a weird gateway to cricket. I've never seen that as a warning. Rave, it gets your kids into test cricket.
Just whilst we're on cricket, right, and I'd never thought about this until about a month ago or so. So I interviewed somebody for Friday 15, a fellow history nerd, a guy called Thomas Daly, who's a big baseball fan.
Mm-hmm.
And the premise was, the shtick was, baseball, it's a game for girls. Don't want to be disparaging, but I just says, you know, it's junior school girls play it within the UK, and it's hard with British eyes to take baseball seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But one thing which I'd never really noticed before were all the outfield fielders wear mitts in baseball.
Yeah.
Whereas in cricket, only the wicketkeeper does.
Mm-hmm.
And you see the most spectacular catches in cricket where people leap like salmons out of nowhere. That ball is coming 100 miles an hour and they'll catch it. And it is an incredibly beautiful, dramatic and amazing thing. Whereas in baseball, in effect, the ball just goes up because of the whole trajectory of it and hitting it with that bat. And in effect, it loops back down. And it's much easier to catch, but they have mitts, which, you know, it's hardly athletic when they catch those things. You know, and it's just the whole...
Is that because you want more catches, though? Because you're not out if you're caught in baseball, are you?
You are.
Are you?
Yeah.
It's not the end of the innings, but you, the player, out, and it's 3 out for that innings, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you are out. But it's just... because in effect, Americans always say cricket is so boring, and its effect is what they kind of say. You play for 5 days and there isn't even a score. And in effect, I says, well, wait on a minute. These guys are much more athletic, much more, I don't want to say manly, because that comes as incredibly sexist, but much more, athletic and are doing a daring do, because they don't have bloody big mitts where the ball just loops into their hands anyway, type of thing.
I think I'm feeling a little bit sick because I'm possibly going to come in for the defence of baseball here.
No, don't do it.
Because the level of fielding in cricket improved enormously when they got baseball fielding coaches in the early 2000s.
Well, I'm going to take you back a step then. Right?
Okay.
Because, and I didn't know that, right? But when you see, you can see some amazing plays with baseball. So it isn't to me just knocking on baseball and saying it's all terrible. And, they'll go and get out 2 or 3 players, and those fielders are throwing the ball so fast, and, they're hitting those bases and stuff. So don't get me wrong. It can be a really beautiful thing. But, again, sufficiently old enough to remember the West Indies when they kind of came into their pomp in the mid-70s, that up until that point, if a ball was struck and you were a fielder and it went about a yard either side of you, you just kind of let it go.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You let it go.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was kind of the West Indies that went, no, we're going to start diving for this stuff, or, trying to stop it. Because the one-day game became really quite popular in the mid-70s. So every run mattered in a way that every run didn't really matter with Test cricket. Mm-hmm. And then it was a cricketer called Derek Randall, who was seen as the ultimate fielder, who was like late 70s to early 80s, who was diving all over the place and was just an amazing fielder and would throw that ball back. But it really was the one day game which really prompted all of that, of which I know there were teams like Warwickshire in the late 1990s that took it to another level. And then you're telling me that, because I don't really follow cricket anymore, or the county game or anything, because the West Indies are crap now, so I've just given up on it, to be honest with you.
No, come on, they'll come back.
No. The demographics are completely against the West Indies ever coming back, because they always punch way above their weight, because their combined population down there is 5 million, 4 million, something like. It might even be less than 4 million. Jamaica is 2.4. Trinidad is 1. Yes, let's call it 4 million. All the other islands are tiny. Yeah. So for the West Indies to be, in effect, for 20 years, the best team in the world was such an anomaly, considering that England is population of 50 million. If you take off Scotland and Northern Ireland, and India is 1 billion plus. It made no sense. So
and cricket's the thing in India.
Exactly.
But the thing with cricket was that was at the time the sport the West Indies did. Now there's the athletics, there's the poaching from the American sports, and it's a much more
and football.
Bigger. If you're athletic and you're a West Indian kid, are you going to do cricket and get treated like dirt by the West Indian Cricket Board? Or are you going to go and play in America, get a college scholarship to America and have the chance of making really big bucks?
Absolutely. And, you go and you'll go to a Jamaican bar and people are watching, like they are the world over, Manchester United, Arsenal, Chelsea, etc. And then the back of the newspapers are athletics and Jamaican football. So like Harbour View and Trivoli Gardens, and they call it the Jamaican Premier League, etc., etc. So, I find it incredibly sad because as a kid, and this all just kind of weave back into the world that we created. Though we didn't have cricket teams, but as a black kid in the UK growing up in the 1970s, there was one area where black folks excelled, and it was actually cricket.
Yeah.
So, and as Viv Richards said, This was significant. Viv Richards was, the best West Indian cricketer for about 10, 15 years or so, an amazing batsman. And he made the point of saying beforehand there had been black sportsmen like Jesse Owens who were seen as being good, but there had never been a team of black individuals. And you have to take the Brazil football team out of this because, you look at them and they're multiracial. Yeah. But actually, up until that point, because, even if you just take cricket as an example, you could only, the captain of the West Indies cricket team was always white as late as 1959.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we weren't allowed to actually manage ourselves. There weren't the political structures because there were still colonies, etc., etc. This was the first time in modern history where you had a team of people who were non-white but were world beaters. Because India being the force that it is in cricket is a later thing.
Oh yeah. It was always home team advantage for India.
Exactly.
Well, they couldn't tour. That was they always used to say. They could never travel.
Whereas the West Indies could. They would come to England and beat England 5-0, go to Australia, beat them 5-0. Exactly. And
I remember
famous blackwashes.
I remember as a kid that the Windies were the exciting team. And I know there's an element of exoticism as a white kid. There's an exoticism to them because they were the only kind of black sportsmen you ever really saw. I mean, a few footballers, but even if football wasn't breaking through, that's a 90s thing, really. And then,
listen, absolutely. So, our world was kind of was so in the 1970s and 80s was so built around our identity was we were British, not English. We were Jamaican. We were black, and so but we're crazy into sport. So when it came to football, I supported Birmingham City and I supported England. But when it came to cricket, I was the West Indies all the way. It was only when I was about in my 20s I realised, wait on a minute, that's a bit odd. But it was because our parents were so fervent about the West Indies, whereas there was no such thing as Jamaican football in the 70s. It just wasn't even a thing. Then all of a sudden in the 1998 World Cup, when you had Jamaica in it, you're like, wait on a minute. Right. So what happens when Jamaica play England, as they have done a couple of times now and stuff? Who do you support? And you know what? I'm completely and utterly confused. I didn't want to see the result.
As a closing point on the cricket thing, have you seen Fire in Babylon?
I have. Yeah.
Yeah, that is. I saw that in the Corner House in Manchester on my way to Leeds for a Comic Con, but that was tremendous because the whole crowd. Anybody who hasn't seen it, it's well worth seeing. It's a documentary about everything that Roifield's talking about in West Indian cricket, really. It was a mixed audience of men of a certain age, both black and white, but just a whole theatre going, ooh. As the chin music's going in at 90 miles an hour on Tony Greig or whoever. It was just this big coming together.
It is sad, but really and truthfully, West Indian cricket has just gone back to the place where it always was within Test cricket up until Sir Garfield Sobers came along in the mid 60s, which was we were an irrelevance because our playing base was just too small. And that was just a quirk of history that for 2 decades, maybe a little bit longer, but 2 decades we were the best team and we had no right to be. Economically, we couldn't really support it. Demographically, we couldn't support it. And, those centrifugal forces of just common sense came back to haunt the West Indies in the mid to late 90s. And then, as you rightly said, the West Indies Cricket Board don't help either because they are incompetent. Bad governance with small populations, and we're back to where we always historically were, which was rubbish, basically.
Yeah. Well, you're not too bad at 2020, are you? Because you've got a few mercenaries, but obviously when their careers come to the end,
yeah,
one way or another, that'll bring to end. So anybody who was taking drinks frequently, because we were mentioning cricket during the Dissecting Worlds episode. Well done. Sorry you're drunk. If we bring it back to imaginary worlds, I was going to say, it's been really interesting hearing about that background, and you're in excellent company because, as we've mentioned before, I think when we did an episode on, I can't remember the specific episode. That's shocking, but the Brontes had a paracosm or an imaginary world that they mapped out.
I think it's quite a common thing, actually. I think it's more common than people make out.
Yeah, and it's surprising, isn't it? Because of our nerdy background, we tend to gamify it and over-structurize it in a way. But you know, it's an interesting direction that people go into, and it's almost like, is it a way of making sense of the world? Is it just play? I mean, play is supposedly exploring the world and learning your boundaries within it.
Well, I mean, I used to, from a personal point of view, I went through a phase where I used to do, and I probably still got some of them somewhere because I never found anything out, of kind of mapping out imaginary cities, like sci-fi future cities. And how I used to do it was I'd start by doing contour maps. So essentially I'd build them organically. Essentially I'd do like contour maps where you'd start with like the high ground and then build it out into bays, and then on the top of that start to put cityscapes.
Right.
So almost build. I know. But almost build it to try and build it up organically. Effectively, you know, so you've got a bay and you've got a little mountain and a river estuary or whatever, and then alright, so the city goes here, and then build it out, which I guess might be quite a European thing, because that's how a lot of particularly British cities are, because we haven't had, or fortunate not to have had in the UK at least, massive eras of urban redevelopment because someone's bombed it flat. Cities like Coventry and Hull and some cities notwithstanding. But there's a lot of legacy, particularly in British city centres, where roads and stuff just continue, isn't there? So I don't know if it's influenced by that.
Well, even after the Great Fire of London, isn't it? That's kind of a notorious example, because there was the plan to have the sort of boulevards, etc., on a continental model. And unfortunately, nobody was prepared to buy out the existing landowners, so you still ended up with all the, you know, queer little lanes.
And it's famously Regent Street, isn't there? Because I think Regent Street was supposed to be this grand European-style boulevard that led up to one of the palaces at the end. And they either ran out of money or they ran out of permission, so that's why Regent Street kind of... And it cut through this massive old section of London and just, like, carved it all out. But all the streets off the side of Regent Street are still the old mazy bits, and then you have this almost, like, French-style, you know, boulevard. Boulevard. That it kind of runs up. That's why Regent Street's like that. It's supposed to run up to is it a park at the end of it? And I think the guy ran out of money, if I remember rightly.
I think you're right. I think you're right that there was some kind of financial element to this. But when you said that this is another thing which I'd kind of forgotten about this. I had and I hadn't. I don't, because this wasn't part of the Isles world or my island continent with all my friends. But my first foray into imaginary worlds was actually drawing city maps, and I did that from the age of 6 onwards. And obviously, you know, it's just a love of maps, and my dad was always great with me because he knew that I loved maps, and our thing was, or his thing was, that we'd go down to London 2-3 times a year for family weddings or for, you know, for Easter and whatever. And easily at the age of 7, he would say, right, so you read the map and you find the way. And you get out that big paper map and fold it out, and, you know, we're going down the blue M1, you know, M6, M1 from Birmingham. And then we get out, then I'd have to get out the A to Z, and we'd find our way to Balham from when we got off the M1 type of thing. And I'd always go past Lord's Cricket Ground, which, and that was just a deliberate thing of mine, always to do that. So, but I think my love of, because I'm an urban planning geek, not at all in a formal way, but I love, understanding why cities have developed the way that they have. Why is this area, in inverted commas, poor and this one is middle income, and why is that rich? Why is the retail here? Why is it sustained here? And I think in large part, a lot of that was because I was a Brummie, that our city got massively redeveloped into a cul-de-sac in the 1960s and 70s, that we knocked down whole swathes of it. So as a 5-year-old child, it was incredibly exciting because there were these, in effect, ring roads, motorways in the city centre, and you went up and you went down. 1 minute you're in a tunnel, the next minute you were elevated. Yeah. So all of my maps at the age of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of cities had elevated bits, and this bit was a flyover and big roundabouts and whatever. And then as an early teenager, kind of realised that actually Birmingham looked ugly, and actually London, physically, in terms of its street map, was crazy, but it was human. London works on a human level, and even though there's roads everywhere, and they're all, crisscrossing each other, but it works on a much more kind of human scale. So, my last maps didn't have any more roundabouts and no flyovers and stuff, and it was grid patterns and diagonal roads to throw in a little bit of kind of craziness and stuff. And again, on one of my Friday 15s, I think it was just 2 weeks ago, I interviewed the Deputy Chief Town Planner, Birmingham. And I've never been so excited. It was like I was interviewing a rock star, and I could actually take him to task and say, why have you done this and why have you done that?
How do you fix this?
It's, and actually at the end of it, he said, that's a lot of fun. Would you like to meet for a coffee? So it's like literally like I'm going out with Beyonce for coffee. I could
The thing is, it's difficult to plug that into imaginary worlds, isn't it? Because then you start having to write whole sections of history. Oh, well, at this point, 50 years ago, this happened, and therefore that changes. So Leeds, for example, has Leeds, for example. If you try to drive around South Leeds, it's awful. It's an absolute nightmare, and they're never going to sort it out. But one of the reasons apparently it's like that is that in the 70s, the council decided Leeds was going to be a motorway city because the car was the future. So they ripped out all the old tram lines, they ripped out all the old transport and they started building motorways and flyovers a bit like they did in Birmingham, except that because it was done over a long period of time with multiple people in charge of it, they don't all connect up. So famously, there's an elevated motorway that's a car park because it doesn't connect to anything. When they built it, it didn't connect to anything properly, so it's now an elevated car park. And now they're spending a lot of time and money trying to rip it all out, which obviously they're doing by putting new bypasses and new elevated sections into kind of, and then you have these weird little cul-de-sacs of roads and flyovers that don't go anywhere, and and if you tried to do that from a fictional point of view, you wouldn't get that. You wouldn't design a city like that, and probably if you were thinking from scratch, you wouldn't design a city like that because you haven't gamed it out from 200 years ago, I guess.
It's interesting hearing both those stories because it reminds me of when Alexei Sale came back to Liverpool and did a series in the run-up of the capital of culture. He was talking about growing up in the city, and he was talking about exactly what you're talking about when the car became king, which I think Liverpool made the moves in the 50s and tore up all the tram lines and started. There's a big ugly flyover that goes behind the gorgeous museums and libraries of William Brown Street and sort of comes down. It's like, even at 7, I was walking around like some Cassandra just saying, why? So as opposed to infant Roifeld who was getting excited by it, he was like suffering great anxiety at this tearing up of the city. And it's interesting when you're saying like you'd have to work at sea. Authors do that. Authors do. If you read I can't remember the name. Is the city called Baz Lang?
Baz Lang is the city, yes, in China Mail series, yeah.
Yeah, he does kind of say, well, this, in the narrative, and he doesn't do the kind of schoolboy thing of giving you 10 pages of his internal history because you come on, this is your homework. But he will allude that this part of the city is like this because of that, or this, this species have settled in that part of the city for those reasons. So I imagine anybody who sat down with the job of mapping Baz Lang, despite the fact, he'll probably continue to write stories there and it will have to be necessarily elastic.
Now, interestingly, I saw a panel at a con once about talking about imaginary maps and are maps important to the fantasy genre. And one of the panelists was China Miéville. And as you might expect, if you've read any of his books, he was quite iconoclastic and opinionated because, well, if you've read any of his books, he's quite
That's China Miéville.
He's kind of iconoclastic and opinionated. And he was very much of the view that, like, I don't give a shit about maps. Nobody cares. It doesn't matter. The story's important, right? I'm not going to put maps in my books. I'm not going to worry about whether it's 3 leagues or 5 leagues to the nearest town. Nobody cares. And when he was talking about Baz Lang, it was kind of the similar kind of thing. It doesn't really matter. I don't want to write a map down and not have the freedom to do something later, if my story demands it. And I'll keep the consistency straight because I can keep notes, but I don't need to worry about maps. He was very much of that opinion, and he was the only person on that panel that was like that. And the other 3 fantasy authors, were all like, no, we like maps. It's a big part of the genre, which probably gets back to Tolkien in fairness. I mean, because Tolkien was writing a history rather than a story, at least when he started out.
And C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, the maps kind of, every time you got a Narnia book, the front pages kind of gave you a new map, didn't you? So you knew you were going into a new bit of the world.
Yeah. I mean, particularly with Tolkien, you get the impression that because he'd written all the Silmarillion-y stuff, it became a useful story-generating plot. Right, the characters have to go here, they go over this. Oh, and there's this thing here. So the story starts to write itself after a certain point, which I guess helps a lot from a map perspective.
I tell you what, you two are very good at this, aren't you?
You think?
Yeah,
well,
you've
talking nonsense.
It's hardly nonsense, but you've got the same reference points, but just about enough clear blue water between you, so you can come at it from different points of view, and you've read all this stuff and digested it. You're a proper bunch of nerds, and I'm scared.
I'm not editing this bit out. This bit's staying in.
No,
it's gonna.
Well, I'm saying this because it's absolutely well deserved. You're doing this. You've created a podcast around a passion of yours, which is absolutely heartfelt, but there is intellectual rigor to it. So, props to you, sirs. Well done. The only thing I'd say,
you're the guy that's actually done it. We're just talking about it. I mean, I think what's interesting about the idea of maps, because you're coming at it very much like this was a form of entertainment and it was a form of like figuring out how the world works.
Absolutely.
But it's also a big part when we get over into our kind of geek space, if you like. Like, it's a massive part of it. There's maps for everything. There's maps of the Star Wars universe and maps of any given, Dungeons and Dragons universes. There's maps of everything you kind of mentioned, and these aren't actually created outside of people like Tolkien. They're not created necessarily by the creators. They're created by fans. It's massive areas of, there's a weird kind of, it feels like there's an impulse to do that and create that physical space and understand that physical space, even when there isn't an authorial intent to do it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But also, it isn't just to understand; it's just to be immersed in that world, and again, just to try and make sense out of it. And what I was going to say when I was trying to blow warm air both up your skirts, gentlemen, is how do you feel about something like SimCity? Because if ever there was a game which I lost days to, it was that. I just adored SimCity.
I lost so much time to SimCity 2000. I'm embarrassed to think about it. I loved SimCity 2000 specifically, is the one I played the most of.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved it, and I particularly loved building it all up and then unleashing monsters to burn it to the ground. I'm not quite sure what that says about me.
But I could never do that.
Couldn't you?
I always took the disasters off. I hated that. I was too precious about everything.
I always loved it when the alien monster turns up and starts burning things down, and that felt like destruction testing it. Like, right, does my fire response work? Can I deploy enough tanks? Can I deal with that? And it's fascinating that all the successor games have disaster expansions. So have you seen Skylines?
No.
City Skylines. I probably shouldn't tell you that if you had a SimCity problem. But City Skylines is the closest modern game I've seen to SimCity. It looks very similar. It's slightly more complicated, as you might expect, and it's a bit clever and a bit more organic as to how it builds its city. And it's got tons of expansions, and one of its expansions is Disasters. It is literally people will obviously buy it as a separate add-on. And they've done loads of add-ons for it, so the basic game doesn't have a lot of public transport options. It's got like bus routes and stuff like that. And there's a whole subway expansion that introduces subways and trams and all that additional infrastructure. So you can really get that kind of city planning thing on. And I think you can lock it into different periods as well. So if you want to build,
you shouldn't have told me about this.
I know.
Yeah.
It's not called City Skyline, and it's not on Steam. And it never turns up in the Steam sale, which is where I got my copy from. But yeah,
you're not helping that, are you?
Oh, sorry,
you're not helping.
All right, sorry.
Look, I've told you before. Computer games are a fad. They will pass. Everyone will be playing with pen and paper like they should do.
But but they're really interesting, those kind of games, because they've kind of got two. I think, as we touched briefly on there, they've kind of got two functions, haven't they?
Yeah.
They've got the have I built a cool looking city and can I build a working city are almost different impulses, I think. Because you can just sandbox it and just build something that looks pretty.
Well, and dare I say it, the first impulse for me, and I think the first impulse for anybody, actually, for anybody, for any child, is actually you're building something which looks pretty. You think it looks authentic to your 6, 7, 8-year-old eyes, that it looks like a city, but you don't really understand how a city works. So when you're 7 or 8, you don't understand, well, you need this bit's residential, this bit's industrial. You might think this is the centre where all the shops are, but that's just about it. And then there's going to be big roads, motorways that come from somewhere else. But actually what you're building is something which has cute names, and you get your felt tip pens out, and your motorways are blue, and your A roads are one colour, etc., etc. And it's just something which is aesthetically beautiful. And then as you get older, real function really comes into it. But still, you're trying to build something which aesthetically is beautiful and kind of apes something that you know. So you never want the sprawl of Los Angeles. You might want your centre, or the Americans say your downtown, to be a bit like Paris with these wide boulevards or whatever. Or you want it to be a higgledy-piggledy medieval mess, so it's kind of the City of London, etc., etc. So it apes something, but then it takes on a beauty of its own.
Well, what's interesting about them, I find, I don't know how you built your cities, but how I end up building my cities is maybe mimicking real-world design a little bit, in the sense that your early city does start out quite pre-planned, but starts out quite small, because that's all you can afford. You can only afford to put a small residential zone in a small business zone. But as the city starts to expand, outside of the city core, then you can start to put your motorways down, you start to your big transport links, and then you get big industrial zones and big residential, and you start to build suburbs, and you suddenly start to see how cities do actually kind of absorb those kind of areas. Because as you have more money to spend effectively within the game, you can go, right, well, I can turn this massive area into a city area, into a residential area, and this massive industrial park. Whereas early on you can't, so you can almost look back on the city and tell where you started. Because that's lots of little small zones, and maybe the roads aren't connected, unless you found the time to get your bulldozer icon out and start ploughing through it and rebuilding your Parisian streets.
But is the game... I can't believe I'm asking a possibly intelligent question about a computer game, but never mind. Is it intelligent enough that it will do things like, if you have a high-class residential area and then it's kind of surrounded by urban stuff, does that area then degrade as like the highbrow buildings get all knocked into flats?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
It affects their crime levels as well.
Right. So you do have, I mean, the example I'm thinking of is Kensington in Liverpool, which is full of, if you wander off the beaten track, is full of really impressive former merchants' houses, which obviously are now multiple resident or multiple family locations because they've been knocked into flats because
I don't know if you can quite
the money
redevelop like
moved
that.
on. Yeah.
I don't think you can quite redevelop, but it definitely basically run-down zones become crime hotspots. If you've got like a expensive zone next to a run-down zone because you haven't looked after it, you haven't tended it, it costs you more. You've got to start building police stations, and Skylines at least kind of bubbles a lot of that stuff out, and it uses the road network as a metric, not geographical distance. So it calculates how long it takes for, say, police response units to get there. So if your road network's poor, your police stations are less efficient because they can't cover the same areas.
So if the guys from the economically deprived area can get to the rich area on a motorway, that would have higher crime than if there wasn't a motorway connecting the two.
Yes, but similarly, it's easier to police because the police can respond faster. Yeah. I mean, that's partly due to computing power, I guess. Because what they actually do is they actually simulate like little guys living in the house and how long it takes, and they'll give them a job somewhere else in the city, and they'll simulate their travel time, and that affects how congestion works. So they're simulating it at quite a detailed level. Certainly the modern generation ones are. I think the SimCities did it a bit, but they kind of goved it a bit, didn't they? I think.
On the point Roifeld made a few moments ago when he was saying like you have this perception of towns, and then as you kind of grow up and your perception changes. I'm reminded of an anecdote when it's not relating to fictional, but I was running a strategy game in sixth form, and one guy was playing the Kingdom of Italy. This was like early 20th century, and he came on with this big list of stuff he'd just done in geography that the Italian monarchy did, and he was going to do that because it was going to be great and it was going to economically stimulate the South and everything else, and it was all like, oh, that's great, yeah. And he comes along 2 months later and he's like, no, I'm not doing any of that because none of it worked. And it's kind of like, when you're a kid making up imaginary countries, you're very much operating on an uninformed worldview, aren't you?
Well, it's like what they say about generals; they always fight the last war, don't they? That actually, if you plan a city for today or tomorrow, it's actually those plans are always wrong because there's always unforeseen economic opportunities, new technologies, etc., etc. So you can never actually really ever keep up. So let alone to go consciously backwards and go, right, so this is what we did way back then, or what somebody did way back when with a whole set of policies is actually not a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for massive conservatism, but actually your city won't be ready for the challenges of the future either, or your country, shall we say.
Yes. Not to get political.
I don't know what you mean.
Yeah.
No, I agree. I mean, I think it's interesting how much. I know it's a point I kind of made earlier, but I think it's interesting when you're raising the Italian thing as well, that how much that kind of geography implies it. Because if you're, for example, playing a war game based on Italy, if you're not actually Italy, you could have different geography anyway. So if you've transplanted it into a different landscape, your political system might fall down anyway, surely. Those solutions won't work.
Yeah, but it was actually Italy.
Oh, it was actually
I know. Yeah, and if you put an analogue and the geography is significantly different, so for example, if Italy doesn't have a massive coastline that exposes it on both sides, it's got totally different decision making to those that actually Italy has. If Italy isn't a country that's kind of divided down the middle between the half with paved roads and the half that hasn't, that totally changes. It's another fictional. Can I move on to another fictional map? And it's just something Matt was saying before about how people do generate these things. I'm guessing, Roifeld, the answer will be no. But have either of you seen the Marvel Atlas?
No.
Marvel as in Marvel superheroes?
Yeah.
Are you talking about Wakanda? You're going to do where the Black Panther's from?
Not just Wakanda.
Is it Genosha?
Genosha.
Oh yes, of course.
But
that area, of course, yeah.
You can buy this thing, and it's about the size of a paperback, trade paperback, and I have a copy, bizarre. even though I'm not a big Marvel fan, because it's just because what they've had to do.
I'm about, gentlemen, I need to leave this podcast. What do you mean you're not a big Marvel fan? Don't tell me you're DC.
Of course I'm DC.
Oh dear.
All gone wrong. It was all going so well. The cricket, and it was fine, and oh dear me.
Oh dear.
No, but I'm more 2000 AD and War comics, to be honest. But yeah, I have more of a soft spot for DC than I do Marvel.
Well, I was going to say, have you read? Then, if you're a Marvel fan, have you read the current Black Panther run?
I've read bits of it.
That does actually make quite a big play of its geography. It's got,
yes, yeah.
It opens. I think the first issue has a whole section of like the map of Wakanda and the geographical situation with its neighbours, and kind of pretty much points you in the world as to where it actually is.
Yeah.
Although all the countries are fictional. But you're kind of
it's kind of East Africa. It's kind of Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania around there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like
Although in the Marvel Atlas, they've tried to have their cake and eat it, so they've kept all the real countries as well.
Yeah, and they've taken bits out of them.
Yeah, so you end up with this incredibly, compared to the real world map, and the Balkans is the same, because Latveria has a few neighbours that it doesn't get on with. You end up with this incredibly fractal map as they're trying to kind of shove another country in.
But I
suppose with the... I suppose in the African context, because so many of the boundaries are kind of arbitrary and political anyway, because of the imperial legacy, it's possibly easier to do that. I'm not sure if it's less offensive, but
well, I believe Wakanda, it's kind of defined by natural boundaries, and that's the justification for it being unaffected by imperialism and stuff. That it's got a desert. I think it's a desert to the south and mountains to the north, or the other way around. I can't remember.
Yeah, and there are these cities which are kind of like gate cities, aren't they? In kind of fortresses, because there's hardly any way into Wakanda. And I suppose the closest analogy in Africa is actually Ethiopia. That Ethiopia is this high plateau. And hence, when the Italians tried to get in there in 1896, they got their asses kicked. So but I've always been fascinated by how Africa, the Marvel Africa, could go through the whole colonial period, and there could be this resource there that the greedy, rapacious West would want, vibranium. But it never got colonised.
Yeah.
You think the knock-on would be quite material? I know they kind of justify it by Wakanda being reclusive and not getting involved and etc. It's like, it's difficult to see it not getting involved at some point.
No, it actually would get involved, because you'd have I don't know when vibranium was supposed to have been introduced into the Marvel world. I have no idea. But it's definitely around by the 1940s, because Captain America's shield
is made out of it,
yeah. So, if you're Hitler, right, you're going to want to go down there and grab this, super metal. If you're the Americans, they're developing atomic bombs and all sorts. You're going to want to go down there and at least destabilize that government so you have a supply of it. You just are.
Yeah,
right?
That's what they did historically.
Exactly. So it's never been explained to me, though I know they're going backwards to try and explain all of this as to the reason why Wakanda could sidestep all of this. The European powers weren't bothered with Liberia because it was just too poor. There's nothing there. They tried to grab Ethiopia. And in the end, Mussolini did in the 1930s. So, and then you look at what happened in somewhere like the Congo, and there were bits of the Congo which were absolutely, almost impenetrable. But because of the rubber that was there, King Leopold got his minions there. So, so to me, it makes little and no sense, because by the time the Europeans would have turned up, the Wakandans would have been, ripe for a little bit of looting and a pillaging, vibranium or not, really. It makes no sense. But the guy that's writing it Ta-Nehisi Coates is a very smart guy, and I suppose that they're going to work backwards to try and figure all this out. But I can't wait to see what they come up with, because with my little lizard brain, I can't figure it out myself. Knowing what I know about world history anyway.
It's difficult unless the answer is the kind of Deus Ex Machina that vibranium weapons or something were able to keep the rapacious Europeans out. But does it, the Marvel universe, in fact, it's flipped to the DC universe. It's like Paradise Island, really? It's in the Caribbean. It didn't get stomped on by someone. But that's kind of the pulp tradition of these things, isn't it? They're drawing back on a history, which was full of lost valleys and lost, Roman cities in the middle of Africa, rice burrows, and all the rest of them. So it's kind of, at the end of the day, if you're prepared to accept a head of government and a head of state that dresses up as a big Black Panther and smack super villains in the face, possibly you can accept an independent country.
I do wonder if it's one of these things that becomes more problematic the more they probe the history. Because it is like going back and going, hey, look, we're trying to make this make sense. And everyone goes, but it doesn't make sense. Whereas if you just go, look, this is happening now, don't worry about it, you get away from that problem a little bit.
Yeah. So stop pointing at the thing that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, because it's a superhero universe, it doesn't bloody make sense. I mean, ultimately, deep down, it doesn't make sense, and stitching its history together is difficult.
But for me, and because superheroes just mean an awful lot to me, and Marvel ones do. And I know in hindsight now, at the age of 48, the only reason why I'm a Marvel fan is because Marvel got it together in the 1970s to do repeats on a weekly basis of their American comics, and DC didn't.
Yeah.
That is it. However, one of the reasons why when I put those two worlds together as a kid, I preferred Marvel was that Spider-Man lived in New York. And Superman was in Metropolis. Where is Metropolis? And I loved Marvel for, where possible, trying to ground its heroes in the real world that we knew. Yeah. And that, to me, just meant the utter world. Coast City, Star City, all the kind of nonsense or whatever.
DC, it genuinely doesn't make sense, because you get real cities and fake cities. So I don't have a problem with them going, look, Gotham is New York, National City is Washington, Star City, and so on and so on. Fine, I can totally buy that, because they're all analogies and it's close enough. But when you say, well, actually, we're going to have Star City and Coast City, but we're also going to have LA, and we're also going to have Washington, you start to go, where are these cities? How do they?
Well, I remember seeing a DC map of America, and in effect, and it had Metropolis right next to New York and Gotham right next to York, because they're the same place anyway. Yeah. And it said, so the population of this America is like 450 million or something. Because in effect, they doubled everything up.
You just bossed a bunch of cities on there.
But the cool thing about that, this is the only bit of DC universe geography I'll defend, is the cool thing about that is that New York in the DC universe, this comes from Grant Morrison and the Seven Sisters, Seven Soldiers of Victory run he did, is that New York's got the inferiority complex. And it's known as the Cinderella sister, because it's wedged between two ugly sisters. Which is pretty cool. And it's kind of a direct contrast to, like, practically every superhero at some point living in Marvel New York.
Well, that's true, actually, yeah. New York is very crowded for superheroes.
Well, or Manhattan, even. Which is pretty cool, the fact that with Marvel Homecoming, they really are setting Spider-Man actually in Queens. So he's not going to be fighting all of his baddies in downtown Manhattan like Spider-Man did in the comics of the 60s. Spider-Man was always from the burbs. Peter Parker was from the burbs. But if he ever fought the Green Goblin, it was always on the top of the Empire State Building or on the Brooklyn Bridge, or, all those fights always happened in Manhattan. But with Spider-Man Homecoming, He's your friendly neighbourhood Spider-Man. You know, he's back in Queens.
He's supposed to be your local guy. That's his stick.
Yeah.
That's the same thing as a Brummie, isn't it? You'll appreciate the fact that apparently the Doctor, when he comes to Earth, only ever visits London.
Yeah, exactly.
Or maybe the Highlands of Scotland. You know, he never goes to a provincial city. Yeah, but that's an alien planet.
Yes.
To be fair, he does do an awful lot around Cardiff these days as well, doesn't he?
Yeah,
but he's pretending to be London.
They've done a couple of bits in Cardiff, I think, where they've genuinely...
No, and definitely with Captain Jack, whatever his name is. Yeah, that was all round, obviously, in Cardiff. But,
yeah, to be fair, Torchwood was Welsh.
Yeah. Set in Welsh,
yeah.
Set in Welsh.
But and this is where I know we're starting to mix things up now, gentlemen. Yeah, you're just letting me just talk stuff
that we
talk about it in my other podcast. So thank you. But being a Brummie and having a great love for the city that I was brought up in, don't half vex me when any depiction of Britain is always London, and invariably there is the Houses of Parliament in the background. However, living in London for 20 years and then being 6 months of the year resident of San Francisco, as I am, I completely and utterly understand the reason why that has to be the case, because London is massive worldwide brand and is totally recognisable, and is seen as being sexy and sellable. You know, and it's not by accident that all these blockbuster films, whether it is Marvel films or not, invariably they fight the baddie now, and there's always one bit where it's in London.
Yeah.
You know, and in terms of selling brand Britain, it needs to be done. But, you know, we are a one city country, a one horse town, so to speak, in a way that America isn't quite, and Germany isn't, or Italy, you know, type of thing. All these other Western democracies have these multipolar centres of power, which we don't have really in the UK, or at least in terms of the branding, anyway.
I mean, given the filming centres, a lot of American cities, most people outside the US think they look like Vancouver, because that's where they film like the Arrowverse and the X-Files and all that kind of stuff, don't they?
It's like New York, LA, and Chicago dominate portraits of America, don't they?
Well, no, and also San Francisco, because you know, like in Ant-Man, they travel across the Golden Gate Bridge. You know, Planet of the Apes. Yeah. So
Star
San
Trek
Francisco's
Starfleet's headquarters in San Francisco for no apparent reason. Yeah. Well, because it looks pretty to fly a spaceship over.
I think it's because they can fly over the Golden Gate Bridge, and everyone goes, "Ooh, they're in San Francisco."
Yeah.
Because in LA, you've basically got the Hollywood sign, haven't you? You can either fly over the Hollywood sign, or you can fly over the Golden Gate Bridge.
Or you've got that kind of rank bit of Hollywood with all the hookers and stuff, haven't you? You got the kind of the greasy underbelly of LA.
Yes,
or you've got kind of
you've got that kind of look to it. But LA I think filmically has a very definite branded look, doesn't it? The kind of like washed out, sun high in the sky, sun bleached look. That's the LA look.
It's funny when you watch like but when you watch like Kojak or something, because of where it was filmed, they have to kind of pretend this clearly LA street is in New York.
That's
just like they did.
Which is the same with the 70s Spider-Man as well, wasn't it?
Yeah. It's like it's awfully bright.
Well, isn't that why they moved? Isn't that why they moved? Isn't that one of the reasons they moved Agent Carter to LA for its second season? Because it was too expensive to dress LA streets up as New York.
That makes sense.
And they needed to cut some money to keep the show on the air, so they actually moved the action to LA because they were shooting in LA anyway. And it was actually just cheaper because you don't have to change the lighting for everything.
Yeah. Or shoot everything at night.
Or shoot everything at night. So.
I did not love Agent Carter.
I did love Agent Carter.
I loved Agent Carter. And the programme was good as well.
Yeah. Hayley Atwell. What a beautiful woman.
Absolutely. And a great actress.
Mm.
I haven't seen that the lawyer thing she's in. Should probably look it up. I'll probably be terribly disappointed. But...
It will be Agent Carter. I liked Agent Carter a lot.
Yeah.
Much
and it was
better
nice
than
how they
Agent Shield. much better than Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., which I just couldn't watch after about the third episode. I gave up.
I think it's really, really picked up in the last 2 seasons, and I know I don't want to be the guy that says you've got to watch the rubbish first couple of seasons till it gets good, because that always annoys when people do that to me. But I've stuck with it, and I feel rewarded for sticking with it.
My daughter, I infected her with the Marvel virus about 5 years ago, and she's now much more bonkers Marvel than I ever was, and she says exactly the same thing. You know, she says, Dad, you've got to start watching it again now. And I says, no, they should be walking around fundamentally in blue skin-tight uniforms. You've got to have the helicarrier. You know, I don't mind Nick Fury being black. I'll cope with that. To me, he still is a white guy, but whatever, right? But they need to be like proper spies. Forget all this on the ground stuff, which I know is just budgetary malarkey. But it's not the same. They should be just fighting Hydra week after week.
He does have a flying car that doesn't fly very often, distressingly. Because if I had a flying car, I'd fly everywhere. Right?
This is why you're not a spy.
This is why I'm not a spy. But if I had a flying car, right, that'd be fine. I'd be like, I fly. That's what I do. I mean, in fairness to it, I'm equally slightly disappointed that they've never dressed up Hydra agents in the ridiculous green and yellow costume and called them Hydrangers, because that constantly amuses me.
Or with the AIM ones as well, have those funny kind of square heads with the eyes.
Of all the live-action superhero stuff we've had, right, and live-action characters I never thought I'd see on a live screen, I still want a live-action MODOK, and I'm like, if you can do a live-action MODOK, you can do anything.
Well, I actually think what they did in Winter Soldier for him, you know, was a nod and a wink in a clever way.
Yeah, it did feel a little bit. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I went, you know, fair enough. And I must admit,
I half wondered if that was what they were going to do. They were going to like kick him forward and have him come back in the future as the beginning of MODOK.
Mm.
But we'll see. But yeah, he feels like that could be a tough sell, but they've sold tougher things. So
yeah, but we Guardians of the Galaxy, so I think it's possible.
Oh,
you are right, because anything you can do anything now, can't you, with CGI? So
if you can get pathos out of a talking CGI raccoon, I think you can pretty much do anything.
Yeah, it's just approaching the material rightly, which we won't discuss DC movies.
Well, I suppose now, if we're going to do, if we're going to look at comic book universes and in the form of dissecting worlds, it was Earth 416 is Earth now, isn't it, in the Marvel realm?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right. So how do you both feel about all the parallel other Earths with whether it's the DC world and the DC universe or the Marvel one? Because I must admit, I've never got into them.
I am gonna. I blow hot and cold on it because part of me quite likes it. Because I like parallel worlds, right? I've got a big soft for them. I got books. I like the concept. I like mirrorverses, like the Star Trek mirrorverses and stuff like that. I think they're quite fun. So I think you can do some really fun, interesting things with them. But I also worry they get quite fan-wanky and top-heavy and impenetrable. So when you hear, for example, DC did whatever their latest big crossover is, and like all these big crossovers in comics just feel like multi-universe-esque now, particularly the DC ones that are just so hard-wiredly focused onto these multiple universes. Like, are these supposed to get new people in? Because I don't see how they get new people in. And I read some of this stuff when they did DC did the whole, we're getting rid of the New 52 and we're going to bring back and tie it into Watchmen. And I read that issue. And I thought it was, and I liked it. But I've read enough that I can follow it. But it still feels a bit like you're writing your own fan fiction at this point. And that's a bit odd to me. So I kind of get a bit lost.
I kind of agree with you. I think when you have little in-jokes, like I think it's the Squadron Supreme, which is the kind of slightly rebadged Justice League that have turned up in the Odd Avengers story. But, you know, they're not just turning up in the Odd Avengers stories. They've had their own limited edition runs. and they become such a separate thing that then, like, next time they want to do a slightly rebadged Justice League, they have to make up another one, and it's kind of like the tale's changing itself. I think in some ways it would be better if they just said to the and I'm aware it's me saying this, the overtight T-shirt crowd, you know what? We're just going to redraw everything every 10 years. Just get used to it.
I don't know if it's our fault as fans, though. I don't know if it's our fault as fans, because we've become obsessed with continuity, right? This idea of hard continuity has become slightly infectious, right? And that the easiest way for people to get around that continuity thing is say, well, there's multiple universes, so we're going to do a story where Batman looks like he's actually enjoying himself for a change, right? And fights crime, and doesn't just mope around the Batcave feeling sad because all his friends are dead. But that doesn't fit with our established continuity, and people will get upset and write angry letters on the internet. So we'll say Happy Batman is Earth 576, and there's a Happy Batman line, as opposed to us as consumers, if you like, just relaxing the fact that these can be variable and these can be different things.
Well, I don't think I agree with you. Because again,
that's why we have guests on.
Hey, again, going back to the reason why I'm a Marvel fanboy. Initially, I would have said they live in real places. The character. Then when I got a little bit older, I would have said the characters are actually more interesting. Spider-Man was a teenager, couldn't get a girlfriend, whereas Bruce Wayne, before Bruce Wayne became dark, he was just a millionaire, a billionaire. Clark Kent was just this chisel-jawed newspaper reporter. Hal Jordan was a fighter pilot. The Marvel heroes were always a bit flawed. Stan Lee did that genius thing back in the 1960s. But the thing why I could always understand Marvel Comics over DC was everything was always happening kind of in the same timeline. Whereas DC jumped all over the place. He had Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes, which was set 2,000 years in the future. Then you had this, which was in the past, and blah, blah, blah. And there wasn't a DC continuity in the way that there was with Marvel. So it pains me now with all these reboots all the time, or with all these crossovers, because actually, if you read those Marvel comics, the British reprints in the 70s, which were all the 60s ones, you got the whole Marvel lore. You got it, and it all made sense, and it was very linear, etc. And they've thrown that all away. And I loved all the references they used to do. So Iron Man would say something, he'd be fighting the Mandarin, and he'd say something, and the little panel at the bottom would say, this refers to Spider-Man issue 321 when Spider-Man fought the Mandarin and whatever, and blah, blah, blah. Well, DC never did that. And for me, the malaise of Marvel Comics now is because actually them throwing all that out the window and constantly having these crossovers and reboots has destroyed core continuity. And people are saying, but wait on a minute. Iron Man is just Tony Stark. Captain America, he can put the shield down and stuff, and the Falcon can be him for a bit, but come on, he is Steve Rogers. And, and I'm saying this, and I'm the minority, type of thing. You can have diversity in comics, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater and try and change everything and have these horrible crossovers all the time. And the reason for the crossovers is because us comic book fans actually do lap them up to a degree. We go, it's number one of the Avengers, but there's been like 15 number ones now.
Oh yeah, they clearly must spike sales.
I think I'm going to heatedly agree with you, Roifeld, in saying this. But I think because I'm like a couple of years behind you, I remember those Marvel trades, and those were like the paper we were given to like stop our paint going on the desks in primary school. So I remember slyly reading those in 2000 AD when I should have been painting. But those little asterisks, those were a neat little Easter egg. Back in the day, they were a neat little Easter egg, and if you happen to be getting, or your mate happened to be getting, Iron Man, then you could say, "Oh, have you got that issue?" And that was a little treat. Now, it's like yeah, you've got to get 7 titles a month, otherwise you won't have a clue what's going on. And that's the difference. It stopped being a neat little Easter egg, and it started being almost compulsory. And now I've got to go to the toilet because I'm losing a battle with certain muscles in my body. So I'm throwing in the hand grenade. I'll let you guys carry on.
Okay, fine. Well, yeah, I understand that point, and nothing annoys me more when I'm reading a run of comics that I really like, when it suddenly goes, here's our event interrupting this run, and then you've got to read 3 more comics that you don't read, and then come back to it, because that genuinely annoys me. But I get why we're doing it. And when you talk about, like, Sam Wilson becoming Captain America, I get why they're trying to do it, because it's good publicity, and that hits, like, the mainstream press, and in theory it brings people in. I do worry that from a commercial point of view, it's actually really stupid. Because if you're selling comics, you want people, generally as a business, you want new people. You don't want to keep just reinforcing bad habits in your existing user base, because they will eventually wander away, and you'll just get this smaller and smaller circle. And to me, particularly with Marvel and with DC to an extent, they've got all these movies up on a big screen, and I am pretty sure more people will have seen an Iron Man movie than ever bought an Iron Man comic.
Well, this is the thing, that the two actually don't. Like,
they should synergize, shouldn't they?
Yeah, but the movies don't push real traffic to the comics. They don't, and almost the comics are like a lost leader now for Marvel. Like they did a Guardians of the Galaxy comic, and you'd think, well, off the back of a movie, that'd be a smash hit. No, it wasn't. Okay, people bought the first couple of issues, and then it just kind of faded away.
Yeah, but if you went to see Iron Man, right, and you really liked Iron Man, and you went to pick up an Iron Man comic, that would not get you into reading Iron Man comics. It's completely different, irrespective of having an actual different lead character. Even if you got past that, the density of story and the back knowledge you need, or say going to pick up a Batman comic, right? Because you've seen Batman vs Superman, and you want to go buy a Batman and Superman comic, and you pick up something in the New 52, you'd be like, wait, there's 2 Supermans?
That's a bad example, though. That's a bad example. Because somebody would say, here's Dark Knight Returns.
Yeah. But there is a more...
That's a 20-year-old comic. That's not going to get people buying... But that's not going to get people... Then you've got no synergy at all, because then you should have something on the stands that will get people to get into reading your comics going forward.
But the problem is, there's 2 inherent problems with that. The reason why it doesn't actually work. Back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you could get comics at any news agent. Those comics at any news agent. You can't now, right? So those Marvels and DC stuff has gone into specialist stores. And yes,
W.H. Smith's has reprints.
Yeah, they have those weird, funny Panini reprints. Admittedly, those are there, right? But, and then the other thing is that those comics now aren't read by the same readership that they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. It's hairy-ass men like us three that read them. Kids are not reading Spider-Man. They know of Spider-Man.
Oh, my kids know all of them. They know staggering amounts. They've never read a comic.
Exactly. Whereas in the 70s and the 80s, you'd have read a Spider-Man comic. Along with the Beano, the Dandy, Warrior, and all those war comics. It was all part of the mix. Whereas kids now just on their Xboxes or whatever they do.
Oh, you sound about 80 years old now.
No, I didn't want to, but it's a fact. And Marvel and DC know this, which is the reason why they're coming out with, the young, it's not Captain Marvel. Is she Miss Marvel?
Miss Marvel is actually really good, actually. I Miss Marvel. I really like it.
Yeah,
it's living proof. If you get some talent behind it, you can launch completely new characters successfully.
Listen, you absolutely can. However, is your average 16-year-old reading it? No. I would say, I'd take a wild guess, but I don't think I'm wrong. The average age of somebody reading Miss Marvel is probably 28, 30, not 16, not 14, who it's actually really aimed at.
Well, this thing, I don't know, and that's the interesting thing, because the companies don't really talk about it. And they must...
Well, what does that tell you?
Yeah, exactly, but they must know, because there's a
they
shift
do know,
to...
and they've known for 20 odd years that the readership of superhero comics is getting older. They're getting greyer and balder and fatter. They are.
Oh, that's true. I am.
I am all of those, so it's fine. I can say that.
But that's not healthy.
No, it's not.
Essentially, it becomes a dying art form that just becomes an IP house for cartoons and movies.
Is there a counter argument that that's fine, but these characters are going into other mediums? So, for example, my daughter's 5; she's learning to read. I can get Super Friends, so that's like core DC characters. No Martian Manhunter, unfortunately, but I can get early reader books for those characters for her. We've talked about the TV, we've talked about the films. There's
I don't think
so
the
much
characters
animation
are in danger
you
of
can
dying
throw a stick at. The characters are absolutely fine. It's that, and the medium, maybe not in the superhero genre in particular, but the medium carries on to some extent. It's just that very cheap, because they were cheap form of entertainment, especially the reprints or the British format comics. It was like 5p or something, 10p, 20p, depending on when you were buying them. They were incredibly cheap. You got Buster, you made down the road, got Wizard of Chips, you swapped them. Everyone, probably 5 people read every comic. And that's totally different now. You're looking at £4, even for those Panini reprints.
Yeah, it's true.
And bizarrely,
but you know what though? But you say it's £4, right? But in kiddie pocket money inflation, I'd probably say that actually they're probably cheaper now than they ever were. I can remember when I kind of say this because there was on the Freakonomics podcast only about, was it Freakonomics or no, Planet Money, only about 3-4 weeks ago, they talked about this and to do with the Tooth Fairy and how back in the day, you'd get, I can't remember, was it a dime or a quarter for a tooth? And they got somebody to work out, and it was a great episode. And they said, so okay, and all these guys, all these men and women are in their, I don't know, late 20s, 30s, whatever. And said, so when you lost a tooth, what did you get? And they said, I'll get like 50 cents or whatever. So, okay, and they worked it out. So that means that, you're a kid in the early 80s or whatever, and then now these kids were getting $4 and $5.
Really?
And actually, it was, and that was the whole point, because this one presenter said, really? Oh my God, I'm shortchanging my kid. Right. And then they got some eminent person that had written a paper about the inflation of pocket money, and it outstrips every bit of wage growth. And, and then they have a sociologist that comes on and talks about how, back in the 1950s, yes, parents loved their kids, but kids still worked and would earn money on the side. He didn't pamper them. Whereas now we indulge our kids. So we give them way more.
Interesting.
And I don't see why the Americans would be any different from us Brits. So I would contend that a Wizard and Chips back in the early 1970s, right, which I always thought was an amazing thing that they, amalgamated two comics, Wizard and Chips, and then kind of had the Chips in the middle still had its own kind of cover and whatever. But I digress. That I think you'll find that the comics are actually cheaper if you take in.
I think.
Inflation.
Allow me to retort.
Mm-hmm.
You might be correct in terms of pounds, shillings, and pence. So yeah, they may be cheaper. However, the other point is, and I know I'm shifting my territory here, it was a lot less crowded marketplace, wasn't it? When we were growing up, you had the pictures, you had the penny arcade, you had comics, sweets. Toys were really, I don't know about you guys, but toys really were only birthday and Christmas. You didn't get toys more regularly. And that was kind of it. Whereas now, you've mentioned video games, kids save up to buy video games. And there's a myriad of other entertainment options as well, which I suppose squeezes out the old floppy paper comic.
No, listen, absolutely. And I suppose the fault of Marvel and DC is not being able to reimagine a world where your average 8, 9, 10-year-old can actually still be engaged by these stories. Because you're right, if you've got to contend with World of Warcraft or whatever the heck my boy's playing and stuff, and then you go, well, I'll throw you that, and even if he loves it, you've read it in 15 minutes, it's gone. Yeah. Whereas that video world is totally all immersive. He can play it with his friends, he can do all sorts, blah blah blah. So as I say, I suppose the trick is, how can we keep this tradition going? Because things do move on, technologies change. It just so happens that when we were in our formative years, it was paper and it was superheroes on a bit of paper, and so we're somewhat affectionate towards it. But still, the more important thing actually are the characters and making those live on. And yes, it's happening in the movies, but I do feel somewhat nostalgic for the episodic weekly or monthly nature, which actually drives the storylines, of which then we get somebody 20, 30 years later reimagine that storyline and whacking it into a movie.
No, it's a challenge, and it's one you'd like to see met, because comics have been proven to make a good contribution to literacy, particularly amongst boys.
Absolutely.
So I don't know how far I'll get when Rowan's struggling to do his reading homework, putting a copy of Johnny Red in front of him, but we'll see. Okay, so we've obviously wandered on the imaginary.
A little bit off topic.
Banging. That's a pain in the arse. Have you got a bottle or something?
No, sorry.
All right. Well,
I heard that funny bang as well.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
But can I just say, gents, I've had so much fun for the last 1 hour, 42 minutes. I don't know how my week is ever going to maintain these heady heights. I really don't. It's gone crashing down, I tell you. It's been an absolute hoot and a joy. And I'm sorry I couldn't quite keep up with all your proper literary connections that you were making, because as a bit of a functioning dyslexic, I try not to read really, and I've got this 450-page book that I need to read for Mid-Atlantic because this guest is coming on, and I'm somewhat daunted by it. But thank you for having me on. If you ever want me to talk about imaginary worlds in future, if you stick to the ones that I created, then Marvel and DC, I'm on firm ground.
All right. All right. Well, I was going to say we've wandered all over the imaginary map of this podcast.
We fell off the imaginary map a little bit, but
we've gone into uncharted territory. But thank you very much for coming on, Roifeld. I am conscious I have 8 hours of a project meeting tomorrow, which again. Obviously, I'm not going to prejudge it. It may reach these heady heights, but I'm going to guess it might not in some parts.
No. I've still got the auditors in at work, so
yeah.
To be vaguely
awake. Yeah. So thanks very much, Roifeld. And I think for the benefit of our listeners, if you can give them the highlights where they can find the various podcasts you do.
Sure. So I'm on all good podcatchers, and quick rundown of what I do. Dum-de-dum, if you love the Archers, there's an imaginary world. Crumbs, how did I forget to put that one in?
And I've got a map of Ambridge. I've actually set role-playing games there.
Oh my god.
You know what? You're on a different level to me, you are, I tell you. You're special. I've got a few of those maps of Ambridge too. So I do a thing called Dum-de-dum, where I dissect with my co-host, Lucy Freeman, who's incredibly funny and witty. And we talk about the Archers each week. Then I do get a little bit more serious, where I discuss US and UK politics. And there's a thing called Mid-Atlantic, which I do with Reggie Hubbard, who's a Democratic Party operative, and with John Elledge, who loves a map and actually works with the New Statesman journalist for that. And then I also do 10 American Presidents, and at the moment I'm editing the election of 1800. And what I try to do there is try and make it a feast for the ears. So it's supposed to be cinema for the ears. Not everybody loves it and gets it, and people go, oh my God, turn that music down and whatever. But it's supposed to be cinema for the ears, and I kind of love that. It's kind of my passion. And then I do Friday 15, which, as I said at the start of the shows, I interview just any old random person about anything for 15 minutes and then throw 15 minutes worth of music. And then the first podcast that I did was this thing called How Jamaica Conquered the World, which I'm incredibly proud of, being the son of Jamaican immigrants, which looks at the cultural spread of the island of Jamaica since its independence some 50 odd years ago. And that's kind of like an audio documentary, and some of the shows are actually kind of quite short. So it looks at not just the spread of reggae music, but also the birth of hip hop, which wouldn't have happened without Jamaican immigrants within the New York area, or whether it's the countercultural totem that is dreadlocks. You know, it's all there in How Jamaica Conquered the World. That's what I do. Oh, and you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Roifeld, Roifield.
And never sleeps.
Yay.
And he's a proper grown-up podcaster, as I said at the start. So that's been terrific. Thank you very much, Roifeld.
That's been a lot of fun.
I hope you have a good week.
Me too. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Good
Bye.
night.
We value feedback, corrections and your opinions. Either email us at dissectingworlds@yahoo.co.uk or follow us on Twitter. Details are on the show notes.